Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to BrisScience. We are here in September for another online BrisScience event brought to you by the University of Queensland. I'm your MC for this evening, Joel Gilmore. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting tonight and pay my respect to elders both past and present. Tonight, we are, of course, online once again for BrisScience, which means that there are a couple of changes to the way the event runs. At the end of the talk, I will ask as many questions of our speaker as I can, and hopefully we will get through all of them, but we will see. So last month, we were talking about how to preserve our oceans and their plant life. This month, we're turning to our animal friends. Because while the ecological changes, so from climate change, bushfires and more, while they're not great for humans, it's also hard on other Australian species. The key is, how do you track and monitor that? So tonight I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Elisa Bayraktarov, who is an ecologist, a brilliant user of data and a program manager at EcoCommons, building solutions for environmental and ecological modelling. And she's going to talk about an exciting tool that is now available to monitor the health of our ecosystems, the Threatened Species Index, with some good and some bad news stories attached. So to tell us more, please welcome Dr. Elisa Bayraktarov.
Hi, everyone. Let me try to share my screen with you guys. There we go. Let's make it a little bit bigger. And yeah, thanks for the introduction, Joel, and welcome to my talk, everyone. So I'm very excited to take you on a journey about how Australia got its first Threatened Species Index and what it actually means for threatened species. But to start off with, here's a couple of pretty pictures of some creatures that I'd really like to share with you guys. And if I may have my first poll, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about what those critters all have in common. And while you're looking at the poll, I'll tell you who they are. So in the upper left corner, we have the Guldian finches from the Kimberley. Then we have the pygmy possum. Everybody knows the Tassie devil next to it. In the mid row, we have the eastern region parrots. We have the numbat, the leatherback turtle. And then on the lower line, we have the swift parrot, followed by the hooded plover with the chick from the Mornington Peninsula, and the quokka from the Rottnest Island, and the corroboree frog. And let's have a look what you guys have voted, what you think all of them have in common. There seem to be a couple of votes still coming in. Okay, they're still coming in. Let's have a look and share the poll. Yes, you're right. They are all threatened species. I hope you can see this poll, but they're also sweet. They're all animals and they're Australian. Actually, all of those questions are correct. But I'm glad to hear that you guys know that they are threatened species. All right, I'll just get rid of this poll. Stop sharing. Threatened species. They are all threatened species. So all of this, as I mentioned, all of these answers were correct, but one thing those species all have in common is that they are all threatened. That means that they are all vulnerable to endangerment in the near future. And who tells us what a threatened species is? Well, internationally, it's the job of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, to decide how threatened the species is. And they look at metrics such as biomass or the numbers of species or how they're populating an area of space. They look at metrics like that and then they decide how threatened the species is or how close it is to extinction. And then the species are being classified in categories like vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, well, extinct in the wild and extinct. And then just before threatened, we have the near threatened species. So those ones are the ones that we are keeping and keep watching while they might become threatened. So this is internationally. And here in Australia, it's the job of the Australian government. The Australian government has the responsibility to assess how threatened a species is according to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act that was created in 1999. So in order to get a species listed as threatened, first it has to be nominated, and that's usually done by an expert. Then this nomination goes for assessment by the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, where all the evidence and data is being evaluated. And then the committee makes a recommendation based on the evidence provided to the environmental minister, who then lists the species as threatened. And categories are very similar to the international ones. So we have extinct, extinct in the wild, and then the threatened categories are critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. And there is one Australian category called conservation dependent. Now, there are lots of threatened species in Australia, and in fact, we currently have more than 1,800 species listed as threatened nationally here in Australia. And I have to tell you the sad story that over the last 200 years, about 100 species actually became extinct. But of course, we don't want to see any more extinction happening. So in Australia, recovering threatened species has also been the focus of a national strategy. And the first threatened species strategy has been developed in 2015. And in that same year, so in 2015, the so-called Threatened Species Recovery Hub came into life. So that hub is one of the 6 research hubs across Australia financed by the National Environmental Science Programme. So that's funding by the government and 11 partner organizations, of which UQ is one. And this research hub, this Threatened Species Recovery Hub, has the mission to do research and accumulate knowledge that will help land managers and policymakers recover threatened species and prevent further extinctions in the future. Now, of course, real on-the-ground impact is impossible without real partnerships. So the Threatened Species Recovery Hub has partnered with 126 organizations. And these are organizations from academia, so from other universities, from government, from non-government, citizen scientists, and together we do research to save threatened species. As I mentioned before, we have over 1,800 threatened species in Australia. And until recently, everybody was collecting monitoring data, and much of this data was available for many of the species, but everybody was holding on to it. And there was no way to bring this information all together and learn something about the bigger picture. So this project that I'm going to tell you about has tackled this challenge by developing Australia's first threatened species index. And what the index does is it compiles all available monitoring data to tell us how our threatened species are going overall. So what's the bigger picture, and also which groups of threatened species are doing better or worse, and which ones really are in bad trouble and require our immediate action and help. And when we started developing the Threatened Species Index in Australia, we actually looked at other places where people are already tracking how things are going. So for instance, in the economy, we have stock market indices that track economic health. And in the same way, we started working on an index that can report on changes in threatened species populations. Now, where is the data? So this is species data in Europe in black. And in Europe and UK, they are really great headline indicators for biodiversity trends. But Europe has a very small area which is densely populated and many people who collect data. And it does seem from this map here that I'm showing you that we Europeans, and you probably have noticed, I'm not an Australian, I'm actually from Germany. Turns out we Europeans, we really like collecting data. This is the case in Australia. So here we have a very low population density, so we don't have too many people, while there is a huge diversity of in the environment. So there are lots of different species. And a big part of this job to develop an index for threatened species was to really identify where all that data sit and bring them all together in one place and arrange for data sharing. Now, you may imagine that this might not be an easy job, and let me tell you something, it was actually quite tough. But there is a secret to success if you're developing a national headline indicator for threatened species, and that secret is called real partnerships and collaborations with as many organizations as possible, especially those ones who go in the field and collect data on threatened species. So, and this is what we did. So the Threatened Species Index research was led by our team at the University of Queensland. And we engaged early on with a conservation NGO called BirdLife Australia. And we're also supported by the Australian government's National Environmental Science Program. So we also had on board the Australian government, the Commonwealth, Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. We also collaborated with all state and territory governments and over 30 other conservation and research organizations. And in addition, we have something about 200 what we call friends of the index. So those are supporters, potential investors, end users, or people who just care about threatened species and want to know more about the index. So I'd like to mention and acknowledge the pioneers who really helped me make this index become reality. So Professor Hugh Possingham was the visionary of the project, who's been dreaming about a threatened species index for the last 20 years. Now Hugh is the Queensland chief scientist, so hopefully he'll tell the people from the Queensland government about our tool. And then Aisha Tulloch, Dr. Aisha Tulloch is our field monitoring guru expert, who's helped enormously with data analysis and science. And now the baton was passed to Dr. Misha Jackson, our new postdoctoral researcher, to drive the further development of the index. And my unofficial nickname for her is maybe the doer. So how is the index created? We have used the Living Planet Index approach to, the Living Planet Index was designed by the World Wildlife Fund and the Zoological Society of London. And this index tracks changes in global vertebrates through time. So they look at all the birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians and fishes that they can extract from the published literature. And then a trend is being created that in this case goes from 1970 to 2016. And while the index starts at 1, it's showing a decrease in index for all these vertebrates of 68%. In fact, last week, the last Living Planet report where these indices are being published have been released. Now, the Living Planet Index compiles data mainly from the published scientific literature. And of course, in 2016, when I started this project, we looked at the database of the Living Planet Index, but we only found something like 24 threatened mammals and 7 threatened birds. So for some reasons, we realized that threatened species data is often not published for Australia. And that's because people are careful to not, about sensitive locations of species because they might get poached or they are on private grounds. So there are quite a bit of sensitivities related to threatened species. Now, let me tell you what's happening behind the scenes of actually producing a threatened species index. So the first step, of course, is engaging with our data providers. We call them data custodians. So those are the people who go in the field and collect data on threatened species. And then we asked them to provide this data to us in a standardized way, so in an uploading template. And then this data is getting uploaded into a confidential database that contains all the full resolution spatial information on the species. Now from here, we run all the data quality checks and data processing steps required. We also aggregate the data temporarily, so we're building annual means, and we are also aggregating the data in areas, so spatial aggregation. And now, in this stage, we have removed all the sensitivity around the data so that the data can be actually collated into what we call an aggregated database and be made open access for anyone to download and share and use. So this is the information that we use to run the Living Planet Index and produce the plots and feed them into a web app that I'll show you in a couple of minutes. Let me first tell you the story about the threatened bird index. So initially we started with an index for birds because we knew that there will be enough standardized monitoring data out there, and also because we had partners with BirdLife Australia, who are one of the major non-governmental organizations doing conservation and monitoring of birds in Australia. This is the overall threatened bird index for Australia. And the index shows the average change in populations of many, many birds compared to a base year. So it's showing relative changes through time, and it's comparing them to an index value of 1 at the very first year where the index begins. So in this case, the index runs between 1985 and 2016. You see here at the very first year, the index is set to 1, and then this is the rate of change of all the birds from which we had received data. And in that case, it's showing a decrease in index value of 59% over the last 30 years. So this trend is based on 65 birds, so species and subspecies, from over 17,000 sites or locations where people would go and monitor them, from 400,000 surveys. So imagine if I was to go this next weekend, to survey a bird somewhere close by, that would be one survey. So we had integrated 400,000 of those surveys. Now, as some regions of Australia have poorer data available than others, we also had to develop several diagnostic tools that actually tell us how robust and representative each of the index is, depending on the data which is underpinning it. So this slide here shows again the threatened species index for Australia's birds in the top left. And on the top right, we can see where the data comes from. So blue means that we had little data, and pink means that we had quite a lot of data. And you'll see that most of the data comes from the eastern and southern states, and there is quite a bit of a gap in the eastern part of Western Australia, and also in the arid zone in here. The plot on the bottom left is telling us how much data we had to produce this index. So every green line is basically one time series of one bird being collected with the same method in the same location repeatedly over and over again. And finally, the plot on the lower right tells us how many birds taxa we had for each of the years of this index, and how many time series or locations were monitored throughout each of those years. One cool thing about the threatened species index is that we can take the overall index and we can drill it down to extract one certain component. So for instance, if we're interested in shorebirds, we can take the overall bird index and produce an index for birds. And that's what this plot is showing us. It's showing us that between 1985 and 2016, shorebirds were actually doing worse than the overall threatened birds. And we can also look at terrestrial birds. So the story here is that the trend was fairly, well, still decreasing, but almost, well, stable between 2005 and 2016. And we can also look at seabirds. So an increasing trend until 2010, and then a decrease after 2010. Now, we offered state and territories the possibility to also investigate and interrogate the data of the threatened species index by producing trends for their states and territories. But I'm not going to get into too much detail into it. I'll let the interrogation of data to you after this talk. Now, the story of Australia's threatened mammals. How are they doing? This is the threatened species index of Australia's mammals from all sites from which we were able to gather data. This index is a little bit younger than the bird one. It starts in 1995, subject to data availability, and it goes again until 2016. And what this trend is showing is that the overall decrease was 38% over the last 20 years. Now, this index comes from 57 mammals of more than 1,000 locations and over 9,000 surveys. So this is definitely a trend that will grow. So each year, because the index is a dynamic tool, we're getting new data and we're making the index more robust as people share it with us. This is the same trend on Australia's threatened mammals, and you can see again where the data comes from. So there are definitely some gaps to be filled over the next couple of years, and how much data we have, and how many time series or locations, and how many mammals we had for each of those years. Now, we were told by our data providers that sometimes they would go and monitor mammals at places that have received some quite significant conservation management. So for instance, people would go and do some fire management, or they would put out some predator baiting, so to remove feral cats and foxes that really enjoy snacking on Australian mammals, or they can even build fences to exclude those feral predators from exclosures where Australian mammals are safe. And so we asked our custodians about those conservation management interventions and tried to group this data into an index from all sites that have not received any conservation to those sites that have received any kind of conservation, and then finally the mammals that came from places that were safe from any feral cats, foxes, such as islands or predator exclosures, fenced areas. And let me show you how this changes the take on the index. So this is the data that comes from mammals at places where no targeted management has been carried out. And in comparison to the previous trend, this trend actually shows that those mammals have are showing a decrease in the trend of 60%. So, and that's 20% less than, worse than the trend that I showed you on including all of the mammals altogether. If we look at the trend for mammals that came from places where any kind of conservation management was done, we still see a trend that is better than the last trends that I've shown you. In fact, this trend is showing a net increase of 46% over the last 20 years. However, you'll see that this gray cloud here, which represents the variability within the single species trends that build this composite of many mammals altogether. It's really large variability. So some mammals might have decreasing trends and some mammals might have really increasing trends. And that's where those mammals come from. And finally, perhaps my favorite story of all is the trend that shows, that represents data on mammals that have been monitored at places where no predators were allowed. So those are islands and fenced exclosures that are absolutely free from foxes and cats. And see what? An increase of 500%, which I think is probably one of the most stunning results. And the take-home message here is, yes, if we do conservation management, we can actually help our threatened species improve. However, not that much data. in this index. So we'll have to collect some more evidence that this is really happening. Now, after this talk, I will invite you to go and have a look at the index yourself. And all you need to do is go to this webpage called tsx.org.au, TSX for Threatened Species Index. And then you'll find this webpage here. The first thing that you'll need to do is to click on the visualization tool that will get you to the Threatened Species Index. Now you'll also find the index for mammals. We have updated it. It was released in April this year, in fact. And you can select what trend you would like to produce. You can select all threatened species or only the ones that are very threatened. You can, for instance, if you wanted a shorebirds trend, you would select in the group shorebirds, and then the trend will come up. And you may want to select Queensland, shorebirds in Queensland, and you select that. And if you wanted to let this start later in 2000, this is how you do it. And now, of course, you want to see what data is included in this index. So you hit data summary, and you can have a look at all the data that was included versus all those species for which we still have gaps. And maybe the best thing of all is that if you hit download CSV, you actually get a folder with the data as a CSV file. Ignore the error messages, glitches. And this is all the information that is included in this trend. And every row here is one place where one species has been monitored in exactly the same way, consistently through time. We call them time series. Most importantly, at the end of this data, we have a citation field which tells us who has provided this data. So I invite you to go to tsx.org.au and explore the indices that you can build. Now, why do we need an index and what's its impact? Well, I can tell you that as of last year in September, we heard the news that the Australian government, so now the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, had decided to use the Threatened Species Index or the Threatened Bird Index as one of their performance criteria. So they'll be looking at what they need to do in order to improve this index through time, which is great. So people are getting some buy-in, and we're getting more and more data from people. So people really like contributing and sharing data with us. Maybe some of you are aware that the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act has been reviewed over the last couple of months. So we've used the index to be part of the submissions to inform the current EPBC Act review and to advocate for stronger nature laws by showing how our threatened species are going. And this is probably the most important message that the index is telling us. It's really a powerful communication tool that tells us how our threatened species are going and where the worst declines in the index are happening, so that we have to act now. Often I get questions about, can I contribute my data? And the good news is yes, if it's suitable data, if it's good data. So you have to have you have to monitor the species at the same location, doing exactly the same thing. So monitoring the same in the same way and repeat. And then you have to return to this place and do exactly the same thing in order to build time series. So we can't really deal with one-off surveys or incidental sightings. So that's when I'm driving with my car and I see a bird and I say, oh, I saw this bird. No, we can't really build any trends with data like that. So get in touch with us if you're monitoring threatened species. The real champions of conservation, it's really an absolute pleasure to me to actually highlight to you who are the real heroes of threatened species recovery. It's the people who do on-the-ground management and monitoring. So we've received data from states and territories, from natural resource management groups, from Parks Australia, from many researchers, including from UQ, from many citizen scientists like the Queensland Wader Study Group, from teams that recover threatened species like the black-throated finch recovery team, from many environmental NGOs like BirdLife Australia, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and Arid Recovery, and many more. So I'd really like to applaud everyone who is collecting and assembling data for the nation so we can tell something about our threatened species. Now, what's next? Of course, we are developing an index for threatened plants. So in November, early December this year, the team will be presenting Australia's and I think the world's first threatened species index for plants. Now, if you ask me, hey Elisa, what's your dream? What do you want to see happening throughout your lifetime? And I can tell you, my dream is to bend this curve, the curve of biodiversity loss. And we can do it. So the curve of biodiversity loss is technologically and economically possible to be bent if we did something, but it will require some transformational change and we'll have to rethink how we produce and consume food and how we manage and conserve our nature in a more sustainable way. So this curve is showing what will happen if we don't do anything. That's the gray. Starting historically, it's the black, and then the gray is do nothing. Now, if one thing that we can do is we can increase the conservation efforts that we are doing, and that's the green line, right? So we can put more effort into managing and protecting areas and increase our efforts to restore habitat and do better conservation planning. Now, another thing that we can do is we can get more sustainable production. We can get a sustainable increase in both agricultural productivity and the trade of agricultural goods. And finally, we can get to a more sustainable consumption. So we can reduce the waste of agricultural goods when it comes from the field to our plates. And we can also think about, I'm not saying don't stop, stop eating meat. I'm saying that we can maybe rethink about shifting to a lower intake of animal calories and switching them for veggies. So if I may have my second poll, I'll be really curious to hear whether any one of you feels inspired to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. So there are six things that you could choose to do if you wanted this biodiversity, bending the curve of biodiversity loss to happen. Oh, that's really interesting. And I can tell there are already a couple of students in the audience here who would really like to study science and inform policy decision makers, but people seem to really like conservation groups and, okay. People are also quite interested in restoring habitat and joining community groups and buying groceries from sustainable producers and reducing food waste is, reducing food waste is one of the winning, and eating veggies is also quite a big one. All right, guys, while you're filling out the poll, I will show you another inspiration. The last week was the Threatened Species Day on the 7th of September, celebrating the day that the Tasmanian tiger died in 1936 in a Hobart Zoo. So the Threatened Species Commissioner every year calls a Threatened Species Bake Off. So it's basically awareness event where people bake a dessert in the shape of a threatened species to remember the last day of the Tasmanian tiger that died in 1936 on that day. And that's really to increase and build our awareness in the community about Australia's remarkable and unique threatened wildlife that calls Australia home. We do. And these are a couple of the creations. I think they're incredibly stunning. But I think I'm at the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank everyone. I do acknowledge all of our data contributors, data custodians, And if you want to receive more updates on the index or become a friend of the index, drop an email to the team as TSX for the Threatened Species Index at uq.edu.au. And over to Joel.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation, a wonderful mix of both data and very applied conservation, some great messages to take away. So we have time for a few questions here. So if you've got a question you'd like to ask Elena, please pop it into the Q&A chat now on the bottom right of your screen. Of course, if this is your first time at BrisScience, we would love to have you back. So please head to our website or our Facebook page or Twitter and sign up there, and we can make sure you get notified when registration's open for our next talk, which will be on the 12th of October. So don't miss that. More details will be coming very soon. All right, I'm going to go to the first question, who asks, how do we deal with threatened invertebrates, especially insects? They know, given that there's relatively little known about them, but they're critical to the ecosystems.
That's a good question. Actually, some other countries in Europe, I think, have come up with an index for butterflies, which I find very, very interesting. In Australia, to my knowledge, there is really a data gap with regards to data on invertebrates, so insects. And while an index for insects is possible, it all comes to the people who collect this data in a standardized way and provide it to initiatives like the Threatened Species Index to contribute. So I would really love to see this index expand to more taxonomic groups, we call them.
Right. Harold asks, do you have any data on how the recent fires affected our wildlife?
Data on all the wildlife in Australia? No, that's not my area of expertise. But what I can tell you is that when the fires happened, what I did was I took the data from the Threatened Species Index and I overlaid the data from which we knew that fires had happened. And I realized that many of the locations of the threatened species were actually not covered by the fire polygon, polygons we call them, the areas that have burned. So I think, and there will be other researchers that who would know more about it, but my gut feeling is that the fires have actually affected more the common species over threatened species.
Interesting. Thank you. Couple of questions related. So I'll ask them together. Can this type of data set help tell us where to focus our conservation efforts? And how should we decide which species to focus on?
So first of all, I should clarify that the Threatened Species Index is an index that can report on more than one, so more than 3 species. It's a species, multi-species index, so we can't really tell anything about one individual species, but we can tell you something about a species group. And usually species that belong to the same functional group share the same threats. So if we see a trend for a functional group that we have in our index that has a very decreasing trend, like for example, the shorebirds, we would know that this is where we really need to act. Like we need to act in places closer to the coast because those birds belonging to those areas are really decreasing.
Great. Interesting. Question for, was there any very unexpected findings that you found that you might not have mentioned tonight?
Unexpected findings that I haven't mentioned tonight come from my the last weekend actually.
Oh, this is good, hot off the press.
Yeah, hot off the press. Actually, the team and we weren't really sure whether we would be able to gather enough data to produce a threatened species index for plants, because there is no country to my knowledge that actually has an index for plants. And last Saturday, I spent actually a couple of hours looking at that data, and hey, looks like we'll definitely have a threatened species index for plants with lots of data coming, especially from WA and South Australia and Victoria. I can't promise you anything about the other states, but we'll definitely have a new index for plants by the end of the year.
Fantastic. That's very exciting. Probably got time for one or two more questions. So I'm going to jump to, I don't know who asked this one, but I think it's a really great question for us to all think about. Which conservation group or groups would you recommend joining? And I thank you for all your amazing work. And I guess another question more generally, which is how can people use and support the work that you're doing?
So which conservation group to join? Okay, I'm biased because in this project, we've been very closely working together with BirdLife Australia. So big supporter of the Threatened Species Index, but there are also smaller conservation groups like local groups here in Brisbane. For instance, one conservation group that I like a lot is called Bulimba B4C, Bulimba for Conservation Catchment Coordination Committee. They have a very long name, but what they do is they are restoring wetland habitat here in Brisbane, and it's really amazing work. So if you Google B4C, you'll see more information on them. And there, of course, if you're a bird watcher, I would really recommend you to check out the Oxley Common community, which are restoring wetland habitats. That's really going to become one of the, a bird watching place of international significance here in Brisbane, maybe 10 kilometers away from where I live here in Highgate Hill. So check out the Oxley Common as well.
Great. And I'll note, Gary has just mentioned in the chat that the Butterflies and Other Invertebrates Club in Queensland is doing a big butterfly count event in October. So if there are Brisbane people on the call who want to count some invertebrates, maybe you could check that out. But Elena, you didn't answer the second part. Is there, how can we best support you and the work that you're doing? Are there ways that we...
Yeah, there are a few ways. So maybe the most easiest way is learn about your environment and start monitoring threatened species. Then you can contribute the data to the threatened species to make it grow. The Threatened Species Index is a dynamic tool that receives new data every year. And so every year we make it bigger and more robust. So you can provide data. And also at this stage, the team, because the Threatened Species Recovery Hub will come to an end by the end of the year, we are currently having discussions with governments, also with the Australian government, and also submitting proposals to make this index continue beyond the end of this year. So if you really would like to hear more about the index and are a potential investor, get in touch with us. It's at tsx.uq.edu.au.
Great. Well, I hope that there are some very enthusiastic people out there who would like to help out. If you didn't catch that email address, obviously you can watch this video again or just message us as BrisScience and we'll help connect you. Well, look, unfortunately, we're out of time, even though there are stacks more questions in the chat. So thank you so much for your time this evening. It was a really interesting presentation and great to see quantitative data able to reveal these things we all kind of intuitively know. And hopefully that makes it really clear to policymakers and that call to action. So we'll look forward to your talk on the plant index in not too distant future.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you everyone for coming, as we'll look forward to seeing you next month. And thank you all for coming.